Good morning everyone again. We will continue with this NPTEL MOOC course titled Tribal Studies in India, Disciplinary Perspectives and Approaches. So today we will continue with lecture number 12 titled Tribe as Ethnic Group. Now in the last two lectures we have looked at a very similar topic or a very similar theme, that is tribes as peasant and the tribe caste continuum. Now in the last two lectures what we tried to essentially did was to broadly understand the nature of transformation in tribal society, or what sociologists and anthropologists call the transformation of tribes, in a sense that how are tribes responding to different kind of changes, that is both internal and external, and how do we explain the kind of change that tribal communities are experiencing. So our interest was also guided by the fact that every society, every communities in the world, or even specifically in India, are exposed to different kind of socio-economic and political change, and the changes that are happening, no communities today escape the kind of changes that we have talked about in the last two classes, in a sense that for instance with the coming of industrialization and technological advancement, what is the nature of change that India is a country is experiencing, and within that how are specific communities responding to that. But at the same time it is also important to understand that when we talk about the transformation of tribes, we mostly look at the transformation of tribes in relation to the broader context, or the broader the larger socio-cultural context in which tribes are inhabiting. So in that sense we try to specifically address the way in which transformation of tribes is happening socially, culturally and economically. So tribes as peasant and the issue of tribe caste continuum is a very helpful way to really tease out the complexities associated with the transformation of tribes, or transformation that tribal communities in India are experiencing. Now today along that line we will continue to examine the issue of transformation of tribes. So today we will look at the question of whether tribes are ethnic group or not, or who is an ethnic group. Does tribe constitute only a small knit community, which is the generally accepted definition of what is tribe or who are tribal communities, or is it that we are talking about a much more complicated or a much more larger community in the way in which we understand ethnic group in the context of dominant communities when we are talking about the broader socio-cultural change. Now all of us might have heard the term ethnicity or ethnic group. In the literature on sociology and anthropology, it is something which is very common, particularly if some of you are interested in questions related to identity, questions related to nationalism, the formation of nation state, anti-colonial movements. So in some or the other way the question of identity is something which have baffled social science, and sociologists and anthropologists have also tried to tackle the questions of identity in a very significant way. So we will try to really look at what is how can we advance our understanding of tribal communities as an ethnic group. How do we understand, how do we explain tribe as an ethnic group, or is it that tribes are only tribes and not an ethnic group, or is it that we can try to explain the process of transformation of tribes as an ethnic group, right. So before we delve into the topic, we will just try to have a basic understanding of what is an ethnic group. Now ethnic group is defined as one who shares common language, ancestry, religion, social practices and other characteristics. Now whenever we are using the term ethnicity or identity, we are primarily concerned about commonalities or similarities. Now even in this definition, there is this particular word, that is share common language. So the shared common language, ancestry, the idea of the shared is something which is very important when we talk about ethnicity. So if you talk about say Tamil as an ethnicity, Tamil as an ethnic group, then you are talking about Tamil as an identity which is being shared by people, and that idea of an identity may be related to linguistic or the markers of Tamil identity may be related to religion, language, so on and so forth. But the bottom line is that when we talk about ethnicity or ethnic group, we are talking about a group of people, a large group of people sharing something which is common that binds them together. So there are three broad paradigms or three broad approaches, theoretical frameworks to explain which social scientists have used to explain the concept of ethnicity. One is the primordialist, the second is the instrumentalist, and the third is the constructivist perspectives. Now these are three different schools of thought, and then according to the way in which we try to understand ethnicity from this perspective, if you are a primordialist, it means that you are understanding ethnicity from a very specific vantage point. If you are an instrumentalist, if you are influenced, or if you think that you are being, as a scholar or as a student, you believe that instrumentalist is the best way to explain about ethnicity, then definitely you are trying to understand the issue of identity from a very specific vantage point. Likewise for constructivists as well. Now the primordialist was one of the most dominant school of thought, particularly from the during the 1930s, 1940s till the 1950s. Now the primordialist school, many a times there are several important thinkers associated with the school who may not necessarily be identified as a primordialist, but for example, the anthropologist Clifford Geertz was someone who is known to be one of a very important thinker when it comes to the primordialist school. Now what is it about this school of thought? Now the primordialist school assumes that ethnicity has a real objective foundation that defines group identity, and most of the time ethnic group are based on biological factors that emphasize common descent and genetic ties within an ethnic group. Now again, the primordialist also believes in the idea of common, that is basically similarity. Now two different communities who are very who diverge or who have a lot of differences in terms of language, in terms of culture, or in terms of ancestry or religion may not associate themselves as one ethnic group according to this. Now something which is very important about the primordialist school is that they believe that ethnicity is real and it has an objective foundation, in a sense that you can see, you can actually the markers of identity is something which is tangible. So therefore there are objective markers associated with ethnicity. Now the primordialist also assumes that ethnicity or your ethnic identity is given, in the sense that you are born into your identity, and identities have exist in time immemorial, in a sense that communities have been living with their identities for a long period of time, right? It has a very long history. Now it may have ancient roots, it may have ancient histories. So the primordialists believe that you cannot change your identity because you are born into the identity, therefore your identity is given. Now when it comes to the constructivist and the instrumentalist perspective, it is something which is very different, and we will talk about it. Now so the primordialists also have this important point to make, that is the influence of culture. So one is born into our identity, and at the same time cultural experiences and socialization also create a deep rooted sense of belonging. Now all of us in some or the other way can associate with this explanation, and if you look at it, even myself, I am born into a particular community, right? I am born into a particular ethnic identity. So to a very large extent it looks like that it looks like that the primordialist explanation is quite very true in terms of explaining what is an ethnic group or how to define ethnicity. Some of the important parameters, or if we are to break down the primordialist school further, some of the important parameters of the primordialist school is that they believe in the idea of kinship, that most of the ethnic group have very shared commonalities in terms of sharing a very close ties with one another, and the belief in the idea that all of them are related by blood, for instance, therefore the kinship connection comes into play again. And like I said, identities are natural, in a sense that you are born into the identity, you are born into your identity and you cannot change that. So identity is something which is fixed. Now coming to the second school of thought, that is the instrumentalist perspectives. they look at the cultural traditions, norms and values. Definitely we are born into our identity, but then they are specifically interested in the way in which identities are being strategically mobilized to achieve certain political objectives. Now, the argument that they are making is that yes, we do have an identity, but then what they are interested is that how the way in which communities use their identities to achieve certain socio-economic or political goals, right. So, therefore, the emergence of new ethnic identities among early medieval societies around aristocratic warrior groups. Now, let us take the example of, for example, in the case of India. So, one of the important thinker, he is a political scientist, was Paul Brass. Now, Paul Brass looks at, Paul Brass is an instrumentalist in a sense that he specifically tried to look at the way in which linguistic groups in India have used their identity to achieve certain political goals. Now, all of us know that the first state reorganization in India was done on the basis of language. So, and likewise Paul Brass in his study closely follows the way in which communities in India mobilize their caste, language, religious identities to achieve certain political ends. Now, from the instrumentalist perspective, you agree that groups have, ethnic groups are groups that, or communities that have certain shared commonalities in terms of traditions, norms and values, but at the same time you are also interested to really look at how groups are actually using their identities to achieve political objectives. Now, the third school is the constructivist school, which emphasize the political role such as the ability to structure intergroup relations and to serve as a basis for political mobilization and social stratification. Rooted in the notion of a shared ancestry and collective history, this process involves the development of a unified value system and cultural identity. It may also include the adoption of common language and religion. So, the constructivist school make a fundamental departure, particularly from the primordialist school. An important scholar who have really contributed to the constructivist school was the anthropologist Frederick Barth. So, I think he came, it was based on his study of the the Pushtun in Pakistan, where he really look at the boundaries of identity, right. How do people maintain their identity? And since then, we no longer view identity as given, we no longer view identity as something that is natural. Definitely, on one hand, the constructivist also agrees that identities have a very political role. People politicize identities, right? But what they are also interested is that many times much of the identities that we think exist since time immemorial are very recent, very modern. They are very recently constructed, right? They don't exist, they don't necessarily exist in time immemorial. People construct and reconstruct their identities. And many a times, the primordialists believe that you are born into identity, therefore your identity is given to you, and therefore sometimes you cannot change your identities. But what the constructivists examine is the boundaries of identity are very fluid. People may move from one identity to their identity according to their language, according to their culture, according to their traditions. The boundaries of identity are very fluid, very malleable, and identities are very modern, in a sense that they, unlike the primordialists who believes that identities exist, people, the identities that we have today exist since time immemorial. They look at the specific period in which people have actually identified and claim belonging to a specific identity, and they argue that these are quite recent, they are very modern. So, if you look at these three schools, the way in which they look at identity is very different. Now, if you look at tribes also in India, you will see that for instance, the emergence of Adivasi identity. Now, in the last few classes, we have talked about Adivasi identity at length, particularly the use and the emergence of Adivasi identity among tribal communities in central India. Now, it may look that definitely the term Adivasi does have emerged from within the communities, right, whereas tribes is a category which has been imposed on the community, and of course today the community has internalized the identity tribe. But if you look at Adivasi, now one may say that one can trace back the etymology of the term maybe 100, 200 years back, but then its usage began only from the late 1930s onwards. So, therefore, Adivasi as an identity is something which is very modern, and then the boundaries of Adivasi identity is very fluid, very malleable, because tribal communities in Kerala, tribal communities in Odisha or even in Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh have their own specific tribal identities, but at the same time they also identify or claim belonging to the broader Adivasi identity. So, the construction, if one is to really look at Adivasi identity, definitely we will have to really understand the way in which Adivasi as an identity has been constructed by different different individuals, tribal leaders, and the larger tribal communities themselves. Now, are tribes an ethnic group? Can we say that tribal communities are an ethnic group, or is it that they are only tribe? Now, so this has invited a lot of debates and discussions among sociologists and anthropologists, and so scholars have taken different positions in relation to this. Now, let us try to understand how we may understand tribe as an ethnic group. So, one a very important criteria we talk about when we talk about ethnicity is the question of commonalities, common things that constitute, common things that define, or common markers of identity. One common markers that we have talk about is the idea of shared ancestry and identity, that people believe that they originate from the same from the same, they have the this myth of origin. Many communities have this myth of origin that they come out from the same cave, that they have the same roots, that they migrated from the same place, right. So, that sense of shared ancestry and identity is very important when one talks about any ethnic group. Now, many tribal communities believe in the idea of common lineage, and they believe in shared ancestry. Now, for instance, for example, before I go to the example, I will just read out the second point as well. The second is that the identity among tribes, the notion of belonging among tribes is based on kinship and clan structures that we already know, right. That most tribal communities are also primarily clan based. If you look at any tribal society, particularly if you go to the Northeast India, if you look at tribal communities in Northeast India, identity of the clan is as important as identity as a tribe. So, now just to elaborate on the first point, which is that tribes have a common lineage and belief in shared ancestry. For instance, there is this community in Northeast India, that is the Mizo community. Now, the Mizo community, if you really break down the community, then you will see that these communities have within them a lot of tribes, sub-tribes and clans who are spread out not only within India, but even in Bangladesh, Chittagong Hills Trek in Bangladesh, as well as in the Chin Hills and Sakang division in Myanmar. Now, these communities who live in different regions and different countries within India or beyond India also strongly believe that they belong to one single ethnic group. What is the basis of that belief in one single ethnic group? Is essentially the idea of that they have the same progenitor whom they call Zo. So, therefore, sometimes people translate Mizo as me as people, Zo as hill, that is people of the hill or hill people simply. But the other angle in which these communities believe that irrespective of the fact that they are subcategorized into different tribes and different clans, there is a strong belief that they have the same origin, their myths are more or less the same, and they trace back their history to the same place or to the same territory. The strong belief that they have the same roots and origin is something which these community who are spread out not only within India, but as well as in Myanmar and Bangladesh, there is strong belief that the community have a common lineage and shared ancestry. Now, it is this that enable them to have this collective feeling or we feeling among these tribes and clans not only in Mizoram, but as well as in Manipur, in Nagaland also. If you look at tribal communities in Meghalaya also, it is the same kind of belief that most of these communities believe that they have the shared ancestry. So, therefore, if you look at from this perspective, definitely tribe constitute an ethnic group. The second important way to look at this, tribes or tribal communities have distinct cultural practices. Most needless to say, they have unique traditions, rituals and customs which make them distinct from other communities. Now, all of us know that most of the tribal communities, irrespective of the regions that they come from, they are largely an oral society. So, this is one commonalities that you will see mostly in tribal communities, and most of these communities have distinct or unique not only culture and traditions, but also oral tradition. Orality is a tradition in most tribal societies. They have their folklore and indigenous knowledge systems which are very much integral part of their existence or their culture. Common language and dialects. Now, in India, many of the ethnic group, many of the communities that we know in India are not only ethnic communities, they are also linguistic groups. Now, for example, if you talk about if I am a Bengali, for instance, Bengali is also a language, is not it? Bengal is a region, Bengali is a language, right? It's a community as well, definitely, but then there is a strong sense of linguistic identity associated with that particular identity. Likewise, if you say that Malayalam, if you say I am Tamilian, if I say I am Mizo as well, so Mizo is not only, yes, it is recognized as one of the scheduled tribe, but it also have a very strong component of linguistic identity within what constitute the term Mizo. So, many tribes have their own distinct language or dialect, whether they are small or big tribes. When we talk about Mizo tribes, we may talk about a tribal community which is fairly large in numbers, large in terms of population. But then if you look at smaller tribes as well in any part of India, most of the time you will see that they have their own distinct language and dialect, and then the sense of identity is largely coming out. There is a strong correlation or there is a strong relationship between the ethnic identity and the language. So, therefore, language plays a very important role in maintaining tribal cultural identity. Now, the loss of language is if a community lost a language, not only in terms of tribal communities, but if any community lost language, then it also loses a part of his or her culture. So, the cultural language loss significantly affects the cultural identity of any community. Now, in the case of tribal society or tribal communities also, this is something which is very important to understand that there is a close relationship between language and any tribal communities. The fourth way to look at tribe as an ethnic group is traditional social organization. Most of the tribal communities in India, they have a very strong communitarian ethos. Now, these communitarian ethos have affected the way in which the society is organized, the way in which their economic life is organized, also the way in which their political institutions are organized. So, likewise if you look at the kind of social structures, the way in which tribes relate to one another. So, it is also something which is very communitarian in nature. So, the sense of collective lifestyle comes from the traditions, the customs these communities have been following. Scholars have attempted to classify tribes based on the regions and language by taking into account the ethnic, racial and administrative aspects. So, if you look at all these features, number one, shared ancestry and identity, distinct cultural practices, common language and dialects, traditional social organization, all this definitely enable any tribal community in India to be referred to as a ethnic group. Now, all over India, we already know that when we talk about tribes, we are talking about a very heterogeneous, diverse population. And as per the Constitution of India, there are more than 700 communities who are being recognized as scheduled tribes. Now, these communities are spread out across the country, and in most of the states, definitely Northeast India and Central India have higher concentration of tribal communities, but then you will have tribal communities in up in the north, in Jammu and Kashmir, in Himachal Pradesh. You will have tribal communities in states like Tamil Nadu, even in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, even in Kerala as well. So, just to have a quick glance of the classification of tribal communities based on regions, then you will see in the Himalayan region you have the northeastern states, the central Himalayan region, particularly the Terai areas of UP and Bihar, and in the northeastern you have states like Assam, Meghalaya, Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur and Tripura. Definitely Northeast India have a very large concentration of tribal communities, and in states like Meghalaya, Arunachal, Nagaland, even Manipur and Tripura, significant population of these states belong to scheduled tribes or they are tribal communities. The Middle India region, primarily the Bihar, West Bengal, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, and most of the tribes includes like the Khons, the Bhumis, the Baiga, the Mauryas, the Gonds, the Santals or Rawans. Now, in the case of Northeast India, there are more than 200 communities, even if some of them may not get the recognition as a scheduled tribe. But if we are to really look at the number of communities who are recognized as scheduled tribes, then the numbers probably will go beyond in terms of hundreds and 200s. So, and these communities are also very diverse. If you look at the Kuki community, for instance, they are spread out in Manipur, in Tripura, in Assam, in Meghalaya as well. Now, you will see that within the Kukis themselves there are a lot of other sub tribes, sub clans, and these clans may have a sub-categorization within the clan itself. So, there is no end to diversity when we talk about tribal communities. Then comes the Western India region, that is Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Goa, the South India, Andhra, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka and Kerala, the island region like Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So, in all these places, what you can see is that tribal communities are quite spread out all over India, despite the fact that their population may be a little less when one looks at the larger Indian population, in the sense that they constitute about 8.6% of the India's population. But what is important to understand is that in all the states, in all the states, across the country, you will see that tribal population constitute a very important part of country. Now, classification based on language, you can another important way in which you can classify tribal communities are in terms of the Dravidian, Austro-Asiatic, the Tibeto-Chinese, the Indo-Aryan. So, by now there is no disagreement, more or less we know that tribal communities, whether they are big or small, whether they are large in number or not, every tribal communities have their own tradition, they have their own culture, and many a times their culture, their traditions may be quite distinct and different from the larger regional or national culture that we talk about. So, the Constitution of India have also recognized the not only the protection of tribal cultures, but also advocate for the promotion of tribal languages, cultures and tradition under Article 29 and Article 350A. Article 29 of the Constitution guarantees the right of every citizen in India to conserve distinct language, script and culture. Article 350 mandate that every state must strive to provide primary education in the mother tongue to children belonging to linguistic minorities, essentially ensuring access to education in the native language at the primary level. Now, definitely these are very important part, right. Many times when we talk about culture, it may be very difficult to define what is a culture, right. What part of me is my culture? It may be very difficult to define. So, culture can have a component of religion, culture can have a component of language, and it is very important that these cultural traditions or every community in India have the right to conserve and preserve their culture. Now, many a times if you look at if you go back to these slides, you will see that tribal communities are quite spread out. One of the challenges that tribal communities face is that except in states where they are dominant, in the sense that in terms of population, in many of the states tribal communities, particularly through education, end up learning the language of the dominant community. So, over a period of time, what also happened is that many tribal new generations really do not speak in their language anymore. Now, that is why when we talk about tribes and language and linguistic identity, so I emphasize on the point that how language is important and how this maintenance of language is very central to the preservation of tribal life. So, in many states you will see that many tribals are forced to learn the dominant the language of the dominant community, and which in turn led to the erosion of their own language. So, definitely there are specific constitutional provisions to protect the interests of tribal communities, but one also has to look beyond what actually is written in the law. And Indian constitution recognized tribe as a community distinct from dominant regional community or ethnic groups. On the other hand, anthropological studies have primarily focused on understanding tribe in contrast to mainstream culture, particularly in terms of religion and caste. Tribes as such are not studied as whole societies with distinct aspects of language, religion and culture. These features, known as ethnicity, are the main way tribes distinguish themselves. Now, when we try to look at tribal society, when we are trying to understand tribe as an ethnic group, needless to say, most of the dominant sociological and anthropological work never really approached tribe as a community. We try to understand tribes from the mainstream perspective, from the mainstream idea of Indian society by using the lens of caste and religion. But many a times these perspectives help us to understand tribal societies in a much better way. They advance our understanding of tribal communities. But then different scholars or many scholars today argues that it is important that we really study tribal society as the way in which we study any other community. And one of the benefit of looking at tribal society as an ethnic group is that to recognize the fact that they have their own distinct culture, they have their own distinct language, they might have their own distinct belief systems as well. Even if they have embraced different kind of culture and religion, it does not always necessarily mean that they have given up their distinct tribal identity. So, although ethnic groups and tribes are similar in many respects, however, all ethnic groups are not tribes. Now, this point is important. Tribal society are often closed societies, while all ethnic groups are not close. For instance, the Jarawas of Andaman and Nicobar Islands avoid contact with the outside world. Many tribes still practice endogamy, they follow their traditional village councils, and tribal societies largely share a historical relationship with the productive resources which ethnic groups may not share. So, this is not to say that, so therefore, from these points what can be understood is that not every tribal communities are ethnic group. So, there are very specific things which are characteristics of an ethnic group. So, many tribal communities today, just because they are a tribe, we cannot necessarily identify them as an ethnic group. So, therefore, it is also important to make that kind of distinctions when we talk about tribes. Also, with the increased extension of modern technologies and governance of welfare state has elicited different response from tribal groups to retain their ethnicity. There is revivalism, reinterpretation of tribal culture and traditional customary laws to build a consciousness, what is termed as infranationalism. This assertion evokes moral solidarity among the tribal ethnic groups. The assertion of ethnic identity also comes through forming formal associations or proto-nationalism. This assertion is mostly political and demands sharing state power. Now, in the initial part of my lecture, I talk about when we are looking at the transformation of tribal society, we are also recognizing the fact that every society in the world, every nation state in the world has undergone some level of transformation due to the kind of changes that we see in the world today, right? No society is insular from the kind of changes, internal or external. Now, in the case of tribal society as well, say for example, with globalization, how have tribes responded to globalization, or in what ways do globalization affect tribal way of life or the tribal communities? So, one part is that over a period of time, many tribal communities realize that they are gradually losing their culture, they are gradually losing their traditions, their language, so on and so forth. So, we see that in many parts of India there is an attempt to revive their culture, there is an attempt to revive their customary rules and customary norms. And according to B.K. Roy Burman, the anthropologist, this resulted in the two things. One is what he called infranationalism, that is essentially where groups and communities try to reassert their identity by reviving or reinterpreting their culture. And the other part is what he calls proto-nationalism, where a community, tribal communities are advocating for some kind of rights and recognition, and by also demanding some form of political power to the state. So, overall what we see today is that tribes are no longer a community where they are always insular, where they are living in isolation. They have experienced significant change in the last 60 to 70 years, and a new sense of identities, a new sense of belonging has definitely taken place even among tribal communities. Now, if you look at many communities, we don't look at specific examples, we don't discuss it at length. But then if you look at many tribal communities, whether they are particularly in Northeast India, whether they are Nagas or whether they are the Mizos or whether they are the Kukis, then definitely all this Naga is definitely constitutionally recognized as a scheduled tribe. Likewise Mizo, likewise Kuki. But at the same time, this identity also have a very strong component of what we discussed, right, that is ethnicity, or Kuki as an ethnic group, or Mizo as an ethnic group, or Naga as an ethnic group. So it is also very helpful to think about these communities as an ethnic group, because there is a very strong ethnic consciousness which is part of their identity. So definitely at one part, the tribal identity, the tribal as a Naga, as a Mizo, as a Kuki, or an Oraon or a Santhal is very important. But at the same time, it is also important to understand that these identities are not only tribal identity in the way the state recognizes them, but there is also a strong element of this ethnic consciousness that are being part of the consciousness of tribal communities today. So I will stop here. These are some of the references that I have used to prepare the lecture. So thank you so much.